Okay, so this is our discussion of the documentary Club Native to fulfill requirements for A6 submissions. Um, so I watched the documentary. You did not.
Right?
But that's okay. It brings up a lot of different points about like injustices against First Nations groups and sort of like the Indian status and their membership status, because they've got a couple different application processes. So first point they kind of bring up is what makes someone First Nations. It's like the very opening of the documentary. So what defines someone as First Nations?
And you're asking me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. A person with First Nations, by definition, is a person who is the First Nation that was here. So they were here before the settlement of Canada, before the European immigrants came along, before it was discovered. So they're the people who lived here originally.
Okay. Now, in like modern times, do you think it has more to do with custom and culture or like blood quantity?
I think it's both.
You think it's both?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah.
So then in regards to that, with the whole Indian Act thing, who then should have the right to decide who's First Nations and who isn't? Do you think that there should be like a board, or do you think it's because it is so very cultural and full of customs that to exclude someone based on blood quantity when really they could be a part of the community? What do you think about that, basically?
Well, my answer actually is it's already been decided, and we just need to recognize it.
Do you think it's fair?
But, well, with the treaty that was signed by both the government and the First Nations when they first arrived was agreed on by both, although they were forced, as far as what I understand, off their land. So they're kind of like pushed aside. So their land was stolen from them. I think it has to be a congruent effort between the government and the people that are the First Nations to decide what qualifies as First Nations. Is that a fair answer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, in the documentary, they talk a lot about like how blood quantum affects Indian status.
Right.
And how it even becomes a bit of a racial thing amongst like First Nations communities, or even like in reserves and stuff. There's this whole unwritten rule of interracial relationships that's kind of just like a known thing that's not actually an official thing, where dating, marriage, and conceiving with someone who is not of First Nations is kind of frowned upon in some areas because you're weakening the bloodline, or you are like a half-breed kind of thing.
It reminds me of the Mennonites of the Hutterites.
Yeah, kind of. Now, is that something that is like an excusable form of racism to preserve the bloodline? Do you think it's...
Wow.
Because one of their concerns is that they will just cease to exist eventually because of intermarriage.
Wow. That is a tough.
Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah.
I never really thought of that before, where it's like, wow, they're concerned about like preserving their heritage and their people.
So what I guess it comes down to, what do you have more right to? The right to preserve your culture, or the right to marry who you want?
Yeah, that's true.
Right? And yeah.
Sounds like Quebec.
Yeah, a little bit. It has a little bit of a tone of Quebec in it. So that makes me wonder if this is not just exclusive to the First Nations of Canada, it's to any cultural...
Yeah, no, I definitely thought about that.
Yeah.
Now, some bands have their own membership code where, like, there's the Indian Act, but then some have been given permission or have elected to have their own membership code to see who qualifies for like status in their community, kind of thing.
Yeah. That's not a bad idea. I don't disagree with that.
And one of their bases for having that is there's concern about like abusing the services designed for First Nations people by those who are not of First Nations descent, but then that goes to the whole like bloodline thing and cultural, and how do you decide who is First Nations and who isn't?
Well,
because there's people who are a part of their community who are not accepted under this membership code.
well, then you get the other end too, which I understand, because we know of a family who have First Nations heritage somewhere 4 or 5 generations ago, so they're going to claim Indian status, but they're not following the culture at all.
Yeah, that's true. So do you think, like, how do you monitor abusive services, right? Like, how do you decide who is abusing the service and who is not? And is it fair to say that for those who are not, like, full-blooded, let's say, for them to not have access to these services when those who are in access to these services could be abusing it anyway?
Yeah, that's
like it's
that's the dilemma, because if you look at even our heritage, we're not following the Mennonite heritage, we're not following the German heritage, we're not following the Irish heritage at all. But we don't, and we're happy the way we are. We're happy being, diluted into Canadian, right? But it doesn't affect our rights. It doesn't affect the services that we can access like it does the First Nations. So that's, to me, that's the huge dilemma, right?
Yeah. Now, the application process for membership status within different bands, like not under the Indian Act, some claim is flawed or too personal, which actually, after watching this documentary, I do partly agree with. Because to apply for it, you have to go through this like rigorous interview where it's you in front of like their board of elders kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
There's 14 of them, and they all have to like sign off on whether they think you are like First Nations enough to be under the membership status. And they have, like, there's so many different ways to do it. The idea behind the membership status is to like foster community, but it has the potential to really isolate and create divisions, because they do, some of them do take like blood quantum into effect. So they check the ancestry of your great grandparents, and you have to have 4 of your great grandparents have to be full First Nations. So a lot of them are like, all right, it's also based off of character and community involvement. But then regardless of that, if you do not have 4 grandparents who are full First Nations descent, then often you will be denied membership based on something that's out of your control. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So you can be like, your mother could be considered full First Nations, and your father could be of a different ethnicity entirely.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Yeah, so it's very personal.
if you're following the culture, if you're like full-hearted into it, why would it matter that you would have only 3 out of the 4 grandparents, or 1 out of the 4 even? Like, I don't know if I understand the intent behind it, but again, that strikes me back to our own Mennonite heritage, or even the Amish. If you're not following their laws exactly, you're shunned, right? And
yeah, exactly. So I find it very interesting,
and that gives potential for a lot of like mistreatment within the community.
Definitely. I think that a lot of the membership codes, now I don't know if all of them are exactly the same, because this documentary just focused on the one band.
Oh yeah.
But I think that the membership code can have an oppressive nature, and can be seen as very racist, actually. Especially since the First Nations groups have faced so much racism in the past. I would hope that they would be a little bit more empathetic and understanding to those who are only like partly First Nations, and that they would be more accepting of them.
But and the other point is that Canada's not very old, and so the history of like literal survival depended on your commitment to your tribe or your band, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that still has the tones and like literal survival. And maybe even today, some of them literal survival depends on their, it makes me think. I know.